The 9,629th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. At the outset of the meeting, I should like, at the request of the delegations of the Russian Federation, China, and Algeria, and on behalf of the members of the Security Council, to ask that all those present now stand and join in observing a minute of silence in remembrance of the loss of life in a helicopter crash of the President of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Hossein Amir Abdollahian, and all passengers, and to present its condolences and sympathy to their families and the people of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I thank you. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invited the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, and Ms. Margaret Kimberley, activist and civil society representative. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, before I start, I would like to extend my condolences to the families of and the people of Iran following the passing of President Ibrahim Raisi, Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian, and other passengers in a tragic helicopter crash yesterday. Almost 27 months have passed since the Russian Federation launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in violation of the UN Charter. That represents over 800 days of death, destruction, widespread devastation, and immense suffering for the Ukrainian people. Regrettably, the security situation continues to deteriorate. the escalating attacks on Ukrainian villages, towns, and cities, including, in particular, in the Kharkiv region, have led to more civilian deaths and injuries, as well as massive destruction of civilian infrastructure. Strikes have also been reported inside the Russian Federation, reportedly also resulting in civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure. The continued and intensified attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are unacceptable. All parties to any armed conflict have an obligation to protect civilians in armed conflict and to ensure compliance with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. Let me say it again. Deliberate and direct attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure and indiscriminate attacks, including disproportionate attacks, are prohibited under international humanitarian law. All such attacks must stop immediately. Attention should also be given to the environmental damage as well as the impact on human health and ecosystems resulting from the use of weapons. Turning now to the subject of this briefing, over the last months, the provision of military assistance and transfers of arms and ammunition to the Ukrainian armed forces have continued. Much of the information from governments about their transfers of weapon systems and ammunition to Ukraine is available through open sources. These transfers have reportedly included heavy conventional weapons such as battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, combat aircraft, helicopters, large caliber artillery systems, missile systems and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as remotely operated munitions, small arms and light weapons and their ammunition. There have also been reports of states transferring or planning to transfer weapons such as uncrewed aerial vehicles, ballistic missiles and ammunition to the Russian armed forces, and that these weapons have been used in Ukraine. I reiterate that any transfer of weapons and ammunition must take place within the applicable international legal framework, including, of course, relevant Security Council resolutions. Reports related to the transfer and use of anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions in Ukraine are deeply concerning. There must be an immediate end to the use of these inherently indiscriminate weapons, which have a devastating and long-lasting humanitarian impact on civilians. Ukraine is now one of the world's most heavily mine-contaminated countries, and it will require decades of clearance efforts with the support of the international community to make sure communities are safe from the threat of mines. Mr. President, the large-scale influx of arms and ammunition into any armed conflict raises significant concerns for peace and security, including as a result of diversion and proliferation, even after the conflict has ended. Importing, transit, producing and exporting states must act responsibly at every step along the arms and ammunition transfer chain to prevent diversion, illicit trafficking, and misuse. Pre-transfer risk assessments, marking and record-keeping practices, as well as tracing capabilities are of utmost importance. To prevent the diversion of conventional arms and regulate the international arms trade, states have established a number of arms control treaties and instruments. This includes the Arms Trade Treaty, the Firearms Protocol, the Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons and its International Tracing Instrument, and the Global Framework for Through-Life Conventional Ammunition Management. Universal participation in the relevant treaties, as well as full and effective implementation of these treaties and instruments, must remain a priority. Mr. President, From 24th of February 2022 to 16th of May 2024, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has verified that conflict-related violence has killed at least 11,017 civilians and injured 21,445 in Ukraine. It is very concerning that the number of injured civilians has increased significantly for the second month in a row. As in past months, the vast majority of civilian casualties are a result of the use of explosive weapons with wide area effect in populated areas. The Secretary General has consistently and unequivocally urged all sides to avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Such use is highly likely to result in an indiscriminate, direct and long-term harm, and to ultimately take combat out of urban areas altogether. I take this opportunity to refer to the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, adopted in November of 2022. Regrettably, the use of armed, uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles continues to cause civilian deaths and injuries, as well as damage to civilian infrastructure. Just like any other weapons or weapon systems, armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles must not be used in a manner inconsistent with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I wish to reiterate the United Nations' commitment to support all meaningful efforts to bring a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine, guided by the United Nations Charter and international law, including relevant General Assembly resolutions. It is time to put an end to this war. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Ms. Nakamitsu for our important briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Margaret Kimberley.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you all for this opportunity to address the Security Council and to provide a briefing on the issue of peace as it relates to Ukraine and its connections with people in this country and all over the world. As a journalist, executive editor of Black Agenda Report, and a member of the Black Alliance for Peace and the United National Anti-War Coalition, and as a citizen of the United States, the nation taking a lead role in continuing the crisis, I'm eager to speak to this issue. As of now, the U.S. has allocated nearly $175 billion for the Ukrainian war effort and to support the workings of Ukraine's civilian government. For the last 2 years, we've seen a terrible war which would end if this country and others would stop providing arms and instead seek peace. There were opportunities for that to happen in March and April of 2022, when the government of Turkey hosted peace talks between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. The possibility of peace was lost when my country and others subverted these talks by promising the government of Ukraine that it would receive an endless supply of weapons with which to achieve a military victory. Not only has that victory been elusive, but thousands of Ukrainians, the people this country claims to care so much about, have lost their lives. And of course, many Russians have also perished. The goal should be for the death toll to end for both nations. We don't have to guess why this huge sum of money has been spent. We need only recall what the President of the United States and his foreign policy team have said publicly. The Secretary of Defense famously said in a rare moment of candor that the U.S. wanted to, quote, see Russia weakened, unquote. This is a dangerous goal for the United States to have at all. The world needs cooperation. It's the only way to avoid escalation and disastrous outcomes between the major powers. The U.S. shouldn't be attempting to weaken any nation, but should be continuously engaged in finding ways to prevent and to end conflict. Not only is the Secretary's confession dangerous, but it has surely failed. President Biden himself said that U.S.-imposed sanctions against Russia would, quote, turn the ruble to rubble, unquote. No such thing has happened, and other nations have suffered economically from the futile effort to keep Russian oil off of world markets. Global South nations in particular were most impacted by what turned out to be a failed effort. More developed nations, those in Europe, have been deprived of affordable gas supplies they reliably received from Russia for decades. There have been other serious consequences, and some of them have fallen on people in this country, the one most responsible for continuing the crisis. Project Ukraine, as it is called, is a bipartisan effort, with both Republicans and Democrats supporting the continued infusion of huge sums of money to the defense industry, the military-industrial complex, and to dubious projects in Ukraine itself. This funding is not just spent on the military, but is literally supplying many domestic government functions within that country. Most Americans are unaware, for example, that small businesses in Ukraine are being supported with their public funds, with at least $25 billion in non-military aid being spent. It isn't as if people in this country don't need help. Money for weapons continues, thanks to consensus among the political class, while needy people here are being removed from the Medicaid program, which pays for health care for low-income people, as well as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Students take on thousands of dollars in debt to attend universities. The same administration, which is committed to spending money on weapons, has never presented a plan to help the estimated 500,000 people in the U.S. who are unhoused. There are constant calls to cut or end these programs altogether, but the funding stream for war remains untouched. Democracy itself is in crisis because of these endless conflicts. War is not the only indicator of violence in the world, and peace is not just the absence of conflict. War-making leads to immiseration, which is antithetical to the concept of peace. The U.S. public do not have the unanimity of opinion on Ukraine that one would expect, considering that billions of dollars have been allocated. Even those who say they support this effort also say they would like to see negotiations too. A recent poll indicated that 71% of people in this country would like to see a negotiated settlement instead of ongoing conflict. But the millions of Americans who want an end to the conflict have been deprived of the representation we are supposed to have. Not only does the administration refuse to reconsider its position, but there are reports that President Biden wants to prevent future presidents from playing a different role. According to President Zelensky, he's working with the U.S. and other NATO nations on a 10-year plan to provide weapons. Joe Biden can only serve for a maximum of 4.5 more years, meaning that he wants to make a commitment that a future president cannot change. In so doing, he invalidates the concerns of voters in this country and of the people who are supposed to represent them. As a citizen of the United States, I'm shocked by the lengths this country will go to in order to pursue a dangerous plan that's doomed to fail. The most recent tranche of U.S. weapons funding is dependent upon Ukraine mobilizing men, approximately 500,000. Several million Ukrainians fled to nearby states in 2022, but now they are told they cannot renew their passports abroad. They must return to Ukraine, where we see videos of men literally being press-ganged into service, dragged off the street and forced to join the military. The freedom that is allegedly being fought for seems to require a lack of freedom for Ukrainians who face the risk of death in the battlefield. This corruption requires a steady stream of indoctrination and propaganda to keep the U.S. population from asking questions or actively opposing the war. I suppose that is why Secretary of State Antony Blinken thought it wise to perform with the Ukrainian band on his last visit to Kiev. Not only that, but neither the Secretary nor his handlers were aware that the song he performed, "Rockin' in the Free World," is a lament about poverty and hopelessness in a supposedly free world, which isn't truly free. The administration is so divorced from reality, they thought it wise for Secretary Blinken to play this song as men are rounded up to be cannon fodder. I want to add that this conflict didn't begin in February 2022. It began years earlier with the U.S. plan to have Ukraine join NATO. In 2008, William Burns, then U.S. ambassador to Russia, revealed in a cable known to us because of the work of WikiLeaks that doing so would cross a Russian red line and potentially lead to, quote, a major split involving violence or at worst civil war, unquote. As we all know, WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange languishes in a UK prison, facing extradition to the country that has made an example of him because he has revealed secrets such as this cable. I reiterate that there have been peace proposals in the past 2 years, with the most recent effort being made by the People's Republic of China, which has developed a comprehensive 12-point plan that could mean the end of destruction and suffering if it's given serious consideration. Lastly, I would make a plea to the United Nations to use its power to investigate a catastrophic event that is tied to the Ukraine conflict. On September 26, 2022, the Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed in an explosion which also sent 15 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, thus contributing to global warming. Investigations have been closed without conclusion, and at least one internationally known investigative journalist has provided evidence of U.S. involvement. Sadly, no one in a position to investigate in this country has demanded that. It is imperative that the United Nations undertake an independent investigation of its own. This is only possible if fantasies about domination are finally and firmly rejected. Doing so would free nations to be honest with one another, to struggle over issues, but to resolve them without death or expenditures of money that are better used for human needs. I thank you all profusely for this opportunity and for the work of the Security Council in upholding the United Nations Charter on behalf of the people of the world. Thank you very much.
I thank Ms. Kimberley for her important briefing. I will now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, first and foremost, in my national capacity, I would like to express my sincere condolences to the government and the people of the Islamic Republic of Iran because of the enormous tragedy that occurred with the death of the President, Sayyid Ibrahim Raisi, and the Foreign Minister, Hussein Amir Abdollahian, and other senior Iranian officials. As the President of Russia said, President Raisi was an astonishing politician, and he dedicated his whole life to politics. He was somebody who enjoyed great authority abroad. He made a personal contribution to good neighbourly relations between our nations and was key in strategic partnerships. Mr. President, a few days ago, our Western colleagues got us here together in this chamber, painting a picture of the suffering of the people of Ukraine that had no power and food because of the strikes of the Russian military and space forces on various infrastructure in Ukrainian towns and cities. All this was accompanied with fulsome praise of the Zelensky regime, apparently fighting for freedom and independence of his country and enjoying the support of his people. However, at the same time as our meeting, the Secretary of State of the US, Mr. Blinken, drank and danced in a Kiev nightclub. Beforehand, he ate pizza in a Kiev pizzeria, whose walls were decorated with neo-Nazi symbols and photos. We can see from this that our Western colleagues once again are talking nonsense to us. There is power and food in Ukraine, despite the fact that for over 2 years now there's been the special military operation. There are neo-Nazis with whom the Kiev bosses are not intending to fight. They demonstrably invited their American guest to such an establishment. And so they invited him, he came there, so they intending to continue like this. Colleagues, I don't think it's going to be a revelation to you if I say that this is not the only aspect regarding Ukraine about which the Western representatives are consistently lying to us or misspeaking. And I would like to give you a number of other clear examples of this. For some weeks now, among Western warmongers and backers of Kiev, people are in a good mood because the US has allocated its long-awaited large packet of military assistance to the Zelensky regime. Ukraine really is, something is trickling down, and the local senior corrupt officials are happy about this. Although the lion's share of these resources are going to be spent in the US itself, and American civil servants making no bones about this, in particular, as admitted by the head of the Pentagon, Mr. Austin, in the April tranche of $61 billion, about $50 billion will be spent in the military-industrial complex of the US. And we should add another twist that he mentioned. The largest weapons manufacturers, RTX Corporation, Lockheed Martin, and General Dynamics, a couple of weeks before the decision was taken on allocating the military aid package, in order to earn more money, increased their prices by 5.7%. There's a sharp increase in the capitalization of Western military corporations as well. The undoubted leader here is the German Rheinmetall that is controlled by an American investment company, BlackRock. From February 2022, its capitalization increased to 547%. You don't believe me? Well, listen to the Ukrainian bosses. This is what the Ukrainian boss said regarding the new American tranche in a recent interview with ABC. This money is not being given to Ukraine. This money is spent in American factories and will create jobs in the US. That was a quote. Furthermore, military experts say it's clear that there's no Wunderwaffe or wonder weapon that the West can give to Ukraine and that can reverse the extremely negative trends that the Ukrainian army is seeing on the battlefield. Just recently, Western Russophobes praised the transfer by the Americans of the long-range attacks MS weapons that today in their dozens are being shot down by Russian missile defense systems and are also being destroyed, as well as the loaded Leopard and Abrahams. The same fate awaits the notorious F-16. Given this background, the NATO sponsors of the Zelensky clique are still betraying their nerves by transferring weapons to Ukraine. The countries of NATO are violating their international legal obligations stipulated in treaties to which they are party. The International Arms Trade Treaty stipulates that state exporters objectively have to evaluate the risks of the use of the weapons they supply in violating IHL, and they should ban that transfer if there are reliable reports of its being used to attack civilian infrastructure. These crimes, as we're well aware, are being conducted by the Bandera junta, who are regularly shelling Belgorod, Donbass, and other Russian regions. The West not only is demonstrating a miraculous selective blindness, but is also blatantly allowing for strikes in Russia. This is already having an impact on the mood of the Western electorate, which Washington, London, and Brussels is trying to attribute to the malicious influence of Russia. The truth is that from 2014, Washington and its allies have tried to set up a sort of experimental guinea pig in Ukraine in order to spite Russia and ideally to hamper its development. However, the main part of the transformation of this piggy, this guinea pig, was to pump Ukraine with weapons under the cover of the Minsk agreements and to brainwash it with Russophobic neo-nationalist and neo-Nazi thinking. Here, the Americans have really overstepped the mark. The piggy has become aggressive and unabashed. But however hard the Western puppet masters try, this experimental guinea pig is something that they've seen that when the lab rat has grown too big, they've just written it off. And what the aim here is just to get more money out of this experiment and to use it as much as they can, to use up old weapons and to create new ones. So, colleagues, the bitter truth is this is what's happening in Ukraine right now. This is why the Ukrainians, in their thousands, against their will, are being dragged onto the streets and thrown into the meat driver. It is only the Western puppet masters of Ukraine who are interested in this, as well as the Maidan elites, headed up by someone who has already lost all formal legitimacy, the Kiev boss. The puppet masters who recently in Ukraine in March and April 2022 said that it wasn't possible to sign a peace agreement. Today, they are leading Ukraine into an unequivocal collapse. Mr. President, those who really are concerned for Ukraine and for the Ukrainians and who really want to find an effective means of, are trying to find an effective means of settling the Ukrainian crisis, I would like to draw attention to the recognition from Brussels, from the beautiful European garden there, that if the West were to stop supplying arms to the Kiev regime, the conflict in Ukraine would stop in a period of 2 weeks. You couldn't put it better. And however hard the Western sponsors of Kiev try with their assistance to defend Ukraine, for any unbiased and any just thinking person, is absolutely clear that without their harmful interference, the conflict would have come to an end a long time ago. In fact, it would never have even started, because the Russian and Ukrainian people are brotherly people. They have always been and they will remain so even after the existence of the puppet Kiev regime. It is not fortuitous that millions of Ukrainians actually fled to Russia and they feel perfectly safe in our country. Distinguished colleagues, it's important that those of you who are trying to make efforts for diplomatic settlement of the Ukrainian crisis understand this. We have never rejected diplomacy, unlike the Kiev boss, who, in addition, banned any legislation, from having negotiations with Russia. Since today, as has been recognized, this is the last legitimate day for him being in power in line with the Constitution. Any potential mediator has to take that particular factor into account, because discussions of any questions, and in particular the signing of any documents with a leader who is no longer legitimate, really runs counter to common sense. Furthermore, any potential negotiations should be based on the fair considerations of the security concerns of Russia and should be based on new territorial realities. The planned June pseudo-peace conference in Switzerland is a continuation of the previous failed meetings that took place in Copenhagen, Jeddah, Malta, and Davos, and add no added value whatsoever. The basis for discussion at that will be the so-called peace formula of Zelensky. This was confirmed to us during the Security Council meeting by the representative of the Kiev regime. The Kiev boss is not hiding the fact that the main aim of the meeting is to hammer out an ultimatum that does not reflect reality, that as a result they will try to impose upon our country. Of course, all of these efforts, needless to say, will be in vain. Now the West is actively convening countries of the Global South to this sit-down chat in order to present their participation as comprehensive support for Ukraine, and I'm sure we'll see calls for this today. Make no mistake, the conniving plan of the sponsors is to propose to the guest of the conference an unconfrontational agenda. A particular focus will be on nuclear and food security and freedom of navigation, prisoner exchanges, and return of children. And then they will present their presence as a kind of endorsement of the pointless ultimatum to Russia. And the attempts of Switzerland to put itself forward as a neutral mediator, absolutely extraordinary. As we know, Bern has long lost its impartiality by acceding to all sanctions packets of the EU against Russia and by blatantly supporting the Kiev Krieg. If we leave to one side, colleagues, the vain attempts of Western sponsors of the Zelensky regime, then a general settlement needs to happen through political and diplomatic possibilities, and this is possible. In order for that, the West needs to stop arming the Banderite regime, for Ukraine to return to a neutral, non-bloc and non-nuclear status, for it to be demilitarized and denazified, for the rights of the Russian-speaking citizens and national minorities to be ensured. We know that what needs to be eradicated are the root causes that started our special military operation. If Bern and its allies were truly interested in finding a peaceful solution to the conflict, then they would propose discussing these matters at the conference. But they are still under the illusion that at the hands of the Ukrainians, they can inflict a defeat upon Russia in the battlefield. And of course, they are mistaken in this, which the Russian army has precisely shown on the battlefield. I hope that you all understand, without eradicating the root causes of the Iranian conflict, a lasting peace is not possible. We are prepared to work with all who share this position and who does not want, like the collective West and the Kiev regime want, who do not want to bear responsibility for the pointless destruction of tens of thousands of lives and people who want to live without military hostilities by the Ukrainians. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, High Representative Nakamitsu, for your briefing. Mr. President, Russia's pretense that it is assistance to Ukraine and not its own aggression that is prolonging the war is as disingenuous as it is cynical. Let's not forget who started this war. Russia conveniently omits the fact that over 140 countries have repeatedly condemned its aggression against Ukraine and called for its immediate withdrawal from Ukraine's internationally recognized territory. We understand the omission because the fact is inconvenient. It doesn't fit Moscow's narrative that it is fighting the West. It doesn't fit Moscow's narrative that it is somehow the victim as it attempts to brutally subjugate another UN member state. Russia makes appeals to this Council while it brazenly violates Council resolutions. When caught, Russia obfuscates and distracts, right out of the Russian playbook that we all know. This includes its procurement of Iranian drones last year in violation of Resolution 2231, as well as its continued violation of multiple resolutions regarding unlawful arms transfers from the DPRK. Since last December, Russian forces have used DPRK ballistic missiles to strike Ukraine nearly a dozen times. Since last September, Russia has procured over 11,000 shipping containers of munitions and related materiel from the DPRK in violation of the UN arms embargo. Last month, media reported that the 1718 Committee panel of experts inspected debris in Ukraine from a missile fired into Kharkiv. Per the reports, the panel conclusively determined the debris was from a DPRK Hwasong 11 series ballistic missile. And we all know the export of such missiles constitute a violation of the UN arms embargo on the DPRK. The media also highlighted the panel's review of the telemetry that showed the missile was launched from Russian territory. This telemetry data, in conjunction with the missile's identification, proved the Russian Federation procured the missile from the DPRK. It is no coincidence that when the DPRK sanctions panel of experts began reporting on these violations, Russia vetoed the renewal of the panel's mandate. Mr. President, earlier this month, the United States imposed sanctions on Russia for its use of chemical weapons against Ukraine. We assessed Russian forces used the chemical weapon chloropicrin and riot control agents as a method of warfare to dislodge Ukrainian forces from fortified positions. The use of such chemicals is not an isolated incident. Russia retains an undeclared chemical weapons program, which the world has seen from its use of Novichok nerve agents in assassination attempts abroad. We are appalled by these blatant violations of the Chemical Weapons Convention. The United States condemns in the strongest possible terms the use of chemical weapons anywhere by anyone under any circumstances. We are also concerned by reports that Russia seeks to procure ballistic missiles from Iran. Acquiring these weapons would represent a significant escalation in Iran's support for Russia's war of aggression. We urge all countries to cease their military cooperation with Russia, which goes towards supporting an illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. We are also deeply concerned about the massive support China is providing to Russia to rebuild its defense industrial base. The overwhelming majority of machine tools and microelectronics the Russian military is getting from abroad are coming from China. Let me be clear. Russia could not sustain its war of territorial conquest without this support. We call on all countries to instead support Ukraine's pursuit of a just and lasting peace consistent with the UN Charter. The international community's participation in the upcoming Summit on Peace in Ukraine, hosted by our Swiss colleagues, will be crucial in supporting this Council's primary objective, the maintenance of international peace and security. Until Russia ceases its attacks and withdraws from Ukraine, the United States will remain committed to providing Ukraine what it needs to defend itself in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I take this opportunity to express our deepest condolences to the families, government, and people of Iran on the loss of the President, Foreign Minister, and other officials in the tragic helicopter crash. I thank Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu for the update provided and take note of Ms. Kimberly's contribution. I also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Ukraine in today's meeting. Guyana is alarmed at the rising civilian casualties sustained in this war. Even as we voice our concern about the impact of the countless explosive devices launched every day from the ground and air against cities, towns, and critical civilian infrastructure, there continues to be an escalation in attacks with intense missile and drone strikes, increasingly jeopardizing the availability of essential services. Many of these attacks violate the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Guyana condemns the use of violence against civilians and the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and calls upon the parties to uphold their obligations under international law, including international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and to ensure the safety of civilians, their homes, schools, hospitals, and other critical infrastructure. We commend the humanitarian community for supporting the millions of people in need amidst this tragedy and welcome their continued efforts to scale up the humanitarian response. Guyana also wishes to register its concern about the grave risks posed to regional and global security by transferring weapons into an active conflict. We maintain that the supply of weapons and ammunition into any armed conflict situation has the potential to further escalate or prolong the violence and increase the risks of their diversion to unauthorized end users. We call upon all parties involved in the transfer of arms to the conflict zone to ensure that the transfers are done in compliance with relevant disarmament instruments and UN Security Council resolutions. We further call for controls to prevent their irregular transfer and for the parties to desist from the use of anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions, which will continue to have lasting and devastating impacts on the lives of civilians long after the war ends. Guyana deplores the use of such weapons and urges full compliance with international disarmament instruments and obligations. We further underscore that the only effective means of preventing further escalation or instability in Ukraine and the broader region is to end this war and to do so through peaceful means. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And I also thank High Representative Nakamitsu and Ms. Kimberley for their briefings. I offer our condolences to the government and people of Iran, as well as to the families of all the victims of the helicopter crash on Sunday. Ukraine is facing an ever-intensifying brutal onslaught by Russia, which has been escalating its attacks, particularly in the east and northeast of the country. Attacks increased by 17% between March and April, most of which have included glide bombs, which can pack hundreds of explosives in a single blast. Russia continues to target power plants and substations in Ukraine as part of a systematic campaign to cut off electricity and essential services to thousands of civilians. A week ago, this Council met to discuss the humanitarian consequences of Russia's aggression. On that occasion, we highlighted the overwhelming toll that this war has brought to civilians, hospitals, schools, and energy infrastructure. We cannot turn a blind eye to this suffering. On the contrary, it should be at the center of our considerations. President, turning to arms transfers, the reports that the Russian Federation is procuring weapons and ammunition from the DPRK and using them in Ukraine are deeply worrying. Debris from a missile that landed in Kharkiv was from a North Korean Hwasong-11 series. Seen in this light, Russia's decision to veto the renewal of the mandate of the 1718 panel of experts is even more troubling and disconcerting. Apart from this, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has verified that more than 10,500 civilians have been killed and over 20,000 injured in Ukraine since February 2022. Most of these casualties are a result of the use of explosive weapons, including armed uncrewed aerial vehicles with wide area effects in populated areas. Beneath the damage and destruction lie deep psychological wounds caused by Russia's war. Since 10th May, nearly 8,000 civilians have been forced to flee from their villages and settlements in the Kharkiv region. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure violate international humanitarian law and are completely unacceptable. They must stop immediately. We stress once again the need for full accountability for all crimes committed against Ukraine. The upcoming Summit on Peace in Ukraine, to be held in Switzerland in June, will send a clear message in this regard. Malta welcomes this effort, which will provide a framework for dialogue on ways forward toward a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace for Ukraine based on international law and the UN Charter's principles, including sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Until that day comes, we remain firm in our position that Ukraine has the inherent right to defend itself, as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. It is entitled to protect its citizens, its borders, its sovereignty, and its territorial integrity, just like any other member of the United Nations. It also has the right to rely on its allies to do so. On this occasion, we also reiterate that the Russian Federation holds the key to ending this war. It can do so right now by withdrawing its military forces from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I extend my gratitude to Ms. Nakamitsu for her briefing and take note of Ms. Kimberly's remarks. I also welcome the participation of Ukraine delegation at today's meeting. At the outset, allow me to begin by reiterating the obvious fact that the war in Ukraine began as a result of Russia's armed invasion more than 2 years ago, in blatant violation of both international law and the UN Charter. And since then, Ukraine has been exercising its inherent right to self-defense as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter, alongside the assistance of the international community. In this regard, it is frankly preposterous that the Russian Federation, which began this brutal war by invading Ukraine, requested today's meeting on the issue of weapons transfers to Ukraine. Indeed, military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK would be a more relevant topic today. Last month, Russia cast its veto on the mandate extension of the Council's 1718 Committee panel of experts, which had been faithfully carrying out its duty for the last 15 years. The veto was wielded because Russia didn't want the panel to reveal the uncomfortable truth it wanted to conceal. The illegal supply of North Korean munitions and ballistic missiles to Russia. However, Russia's veto will not be able to hide from the truth, nor stop ongoing international efforts to uphold the global non-proliferation regime. We once again urge the Russian Federation to protect the global non-proliferation regime by immediately ceasing its military cooperation with the DPRK, which is again a blatant violation of multiple Security Council resolutions. Mr. President, as the war in Ukraine enters its third year, civilian casualties continue to increase, and the humanitarian suffering due to the destruction of civilian facilities, such as energy infrastructure, is intensifying. Just last week, we discussed the dire humanitarian situation facing the Ukraine people. It is deeply deplorable that Russia has expanded the front into Ukraine's northeastern borders near Kharkiv over the last week, despite the international community's firm condemnations. It has been reported that nearly 10,000 Ukrainians have fled from the Kharkiv border area. Mr. President, as repeatedly emphasized in previous meetings on this important file, my delegation once again stresses that all of the devastating events and the human suffering transpiring in Ukraine are a direct result of Russia's illegal invasion. Only Russia can end the war, and Russia must end the war. For its part, the Republic of Korea will continue to stand with the Ukrainian people until they achieve just and lasting peace in their lands. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président. President, it can have escaped nobody's notice that our work on the Ukraine file is nowadays characterized by alternating meetings on Russia's attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, and meetings that we could call reprisals, where Russia reproaches the international community for providing military support to Ukraine. The link between these subjects, between last Tuesday's meeting and the meeting today, is direct and clear. Russia is carrying out daily attacks against Ukraine, some of which deliberately target the Ukrainian civilian population in a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. And in recent weeks, we have seen the scope of the harm caused deliberately by Russia to the Ukrainian energy sector. France and its partners are lending their support to Ukraine so that it can defend its people against such attacks. What does Russia want when it demands that we cease support for Ukraine? Does it want to be able to raze the Ukrainian towns to the ground unimpeded, to deprive the Ukrainian people once and for all of water, gas and electricity? For each of the missiles and drones that Russia sends should meet no defence, hit its target and cause a maximum number of deaths amongst civilians? President, we will not allow Russia to destroy Ukraine. This would be to trample underfoot the Charter of the United Nations and all the principles upon which our collective security is built. This would be to allow the law of the jungle to prevail once more. The majority of the countries of the world aspire to live in peace without fear of being attacked by their neighbours. Our collective destiny is what is at stake in the defence of Ukraine, and for each of us, the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine impinges upon fundamental security interests. This is why France, with its partners, will continue to support the Ukrainian people in exercising their right to legitimate defence. This is what underpins the Security Cooperation Agreement which we have signed with Ukraine on the 16th of February in the wake of the joint declaration of support to Ukraine of the 12th of July 2023. President, in conducting its illegal war, Russia is using illegal means. It is procuring weapons and ammunition, including ballistic missiles, from North Korea. And to camouflage these flagrant violations of Security Council resolutions, it is blocking the renewal of the group of experts of the 1718 Committee, thus depriving United Nations member states of an impartial public tool on the implementation of sanctions. Russia has acquired and is continuing to acquire thousands of drones from Iran. It is these drones which are targeting civilians, stations, railways, housing blocks, shopping centres, thermal and hydroelectric power plants. We are extremely concerned by allegations of transfer of ballistic missiles from Iran to Russia, which would represent an unacceptable escalation and cannot be ignored. President, Russia claims to be concerned about the consequences of the deliveries of weapons to Ukraine and the prospects that these have on the resolution of the conflict. But actually, Russia couldn't care less. Every day, Russia demonstrates that it only understands force. There is unfortunately, therefore, no other way of compelling Russia to cease its war other than by providing resolute military support to Ukraine. And this is the only way we can put in place the conditions for negotiations with a view to a just and sustainable resolution of the conflict which upholds international law. I thank you.
The representative of France for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank High Representative Nakamitsu for her briefing. Colleagues, there's much irony to Russia calling yet another meeting on weapons proliferation in a month where we have seen the appalling destruction of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. As we speak, Russian forces continue in their devastating attacks around Kharkiv. As UN experts visiting Ukraine in April discovered, this includes the use of ballistic missiles from North Korea. Russia's procurement of weapons from Pyongyang is in violation of numerous Council resolutions and is in addition to its use of thousands of Iranian drones since 2022. We urge North Korea and Iran to cease all support to Russia. We note that any transfer of ballistic missiles or related technology from Iran to Russia would be a significant escalation. President, Russian forces have also admitted to using riot control agents on the battlefield. And the UK agrees with the US determination that Russia has used chlorpyrifos against Ukrainian forces. Both are a clear breach of the Chemical Weapons Convention. This is a war that Russia cannot win and which is costing young Russians their future. The military takes up 40% of Russia's government spending. Every Kinzhal missile costs $7 million US. as much as 130 Russian teachers' salaries. And at the current rate, by next year, Russia will have been responsible for well over 500,000 personnel killed and wounded over 3 years of its needless war. Yet Russia shows no signs of wanting peace. The Russian permanent representative has said himself in this chamber that soon the only topic for any international meetings on Ukraine will be the unconditional surrender of the Kyiv regime, and I quote, Ukraine wants peace, but it is defending itself from a neo-imperial war of aggression. It has the right to project force beyond its borders to do so. Along with Ukraine, we support Switzerland's upcoming summit on peace. It will be an opportunity to demonstrate global unity on principles for just peace based on the UN Charter. Our support for Ukraine will endure as it continues to fight Russian aggression, as it secures the just and sustainable peace it deserves, as it rebuilds and recovers, and as its sovereign right to chart its own course is guaranteed. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I start, I should like to convey our deepest condolences to the people and the government of Islamic Republic of Iran after the tragic loss of life in a helicopter crash of the President Ibrahim Raisi and the Minister of Foreign Affairs Hussein Amir al-Bulhani and other officials and passengers. I thank USD Izumu Nakamitsu for her briefing. I listened carefully to the remark made by Mrs. Margaret Kimberley. Mr. President, Algeria's position on the crisis in Ukraine is clear and consistent. It's our strong belief that only a genuine, inclusive, and constructive dialogue between the parties could bring about a just and lasting peace to the Ukraine crisis. We also believe that any solution has to be in line with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the legitimate security councils of all parties. From this perspective, Algeria has repeatedly called on the party to abandon the logic of confrontation and escalation and to privilege peaceful solutions through dialogue and negotiations. We have also encouraged, and yet we do, the international community, as well as this very Council, to focus on efforts that will lead to peace by creating the necessary conditions conducive to genuine dialogue between the parties. Unfortunately, this conflict is still plagued by the tendency of more tensions, more hostilities, and more escalations, not to mention the consequences of polarization that are steadily nurtured. In such a context, the flow into conflict area and the use of weapons and ammunition with increasing lethality and destructive power can only be a source of concern. The use of weapons can only lead to the loss of more lives, including among civilians, the suffering of population and the destruction of infrastructures, and further hinder the prospect of foreseeable solution to the conflict. Equally concerned in the risk of these weapons falling into the hands and control of criminal or terrorist groups, a situation that could cause wide threats to peace and security. Hence, we call upon the parties to attach high importance to preventing risk of proliferations of weapons and ammunition, and to spare no effort to prevent that risk. In particular, we urge them to prevent weapons and ammunition from falling into the hands of criminal and terrorist groups. To conclude, we once again call upon all parties to uphold the UN Charters and to fully comply with their obligation under international humanitarian law. It is crucial to favor the protection of civilian and civilian infrastructure to alleviate the suffering of people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I join my colleagues by expressing our deep condolences on the death of President Raisi, Foreign Minister Amir Abdollahian, and the accompanying delegation. I thank the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, for her briefing. I've also taken note of Ms. Margaret Kimberley's remarks. While we are once again witnessing attempts to divert attention from responsibility for the situation in Ukraine, the relentless Russian attacks on Ukraine, its people, and its infrastructure continue unabated. Last week, at this Council's meeting on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, we were informed that according to figures from the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, more than 700 civilian casualties were recorded across Ukraine in April alone. In addition, attacks on civilian infrastructure have increased at an alarming rate. The situation in Ukraine's Kharkiv region is of particular concern, with escalating hostilities and intensified Russian attacks resulting in further civilian casualties, displacement, and a worsening humanitarian situation. We would like to express our deep gratitude to the humanitarian personnel who are facilitating the evacuation of the population closest to the hostilities. On the eve of the annual debate on the protection of civilians, we recall that all parties to a conflict are obliged to give priority to the protection of civilians and people who are not or are no longer taking part in hostilities. We stress the urgent need for strict compliance with international humanitarian law and human rights. Mr. President, we have agreed to host the first meeting on peace meeting on Ukraine, and we want to provide space for different ideas. We want to have different steps in place in order to achieve this. The summit from the 15th to 16th of June is seeking to have agreement on a potential future peace process. We do hope that we can bank on the active participation of many of you in order to push forward a comprehensive, lasting peace in Ukraine based on the UN Charter. Furthermore, our neutrality does not mean indifference over and beyond the military sphere. Neutrality means that we advocate a fair and lasting solution in Ukraine. We believe that this is a continuation of our commitment. Mr. President, the deaths, injuries, destruction, and immense suffering we are witnessing would not have occurred without Russia's military aggression against Ukraine. This is a flagrant violation of international law, including the United Nations Charter. To achieve a peaceful solution, we renew our appeal to Russia to immediately de-escalate the situation, cease all hostilities, and withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory. The UN Charter commits us all to respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. We also recall that Ukraine has the right to ensure its security and defend its territorial integrity and sovereignty. Switzerland is deeply dismayed by the fact that Russia's military aggression appears to continue to be fueled and intensified by transfers of arms and munitions to Russia from third parties. We have repeatedly stressed that states must respect and comply with their obligations under international arms control instruments. This includes the relevant resolutions of this Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Mr. President, we are deeply saddened by the sudden passing of the President of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Sayyid Ibrahim Raisi, the Foreign Minister, Hussein Amir Abdollahian, and others. on behalf of the government of Japan, we would like to express our deepest condolences to the government and the people of Iran and bereaved families, and to offer our sincere prayers for the deceased. Mr. President, I thank High Representative Nakamitsu and other briefers for their briefings. Russia has repeatedly requested Security Council meetings on this topic and has made its own unique argument, squandering the Council's precious time and resources. It is a tragic irony that a permanent member of the Security Council condemns those defending themselves from its own aggression, which is a clear violation of the United Nations Charter. Russia has been criticizing continuous, legitimate support for Ukraine by the international community. On the other hand, it has procured weapons from North Korea in violation of the Security Council resolutions for which Russia voted. It has also raised concerns in the international community about what North Korea is getting in return. Moreover, it is truly regrettable that on March 28th, Russia chose to cast a veto to block the renewal of the panel of experts for the UNSC 1718 Sanctions Committee. If the panel had existed, as 13 Council members affirmatively hoped, its report would have certainly included the further investigation on sanctions evasion and even on violation by North Korea and Russia. We once again condemn in the strongest terms these acts of Russia that serves its own interests above its solemn responsibility of the permanent member of the Security Council, the guardian of the world peace, rather than the destroyer thereof. Mr. President, Japan reiterates its insistence that peace in Ukraine must be based on the UN Charter. Russia's aggression against Ukraine undermines the most fundamental principles of international law. The security of Europe and the Indo-Pacific and beyond is inseparable. Unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force must not happen anywhere in the world. What is at stake is peace and security of the international community as a whole. We continue to spare no effort to bring about a just and a lasting peace in Ukraine. Our resolve to stand with Ukraine and the UN Charter will never waver. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I wish to thank the briefers for their contribution and also want to welcome a representative of Ukraine in this chamber. Mr. President, let me make a couple of points on behalf of my delegation. Firstly, and this cannot be emphasized enough, any country under foreign invasion has a right to defend itself in accordance with Article 51 of the Charter and the applicable international legal framework. Our aid to Ukraine supports this inalienable right, and we will continue to do so until this war of aggression ends. Secondly, Slovenia would like to recall that the panel of experts traveled to Ukraine in April and ascertained that a missile that landed in Kharkiv in January is in fact a Hwasong-11 series missile of DPRK origin. Slovenia is deeply concerned over the mounting evidence on Russia's missile procurement from DPRK. This is a violation of multiple Security Council resolutions and needs to be urgently addressed. We would also like to express our dismay over Security Council's inability to extend the mandate of the 1718 panel of experts, which should have been extended, but it was instead vetoed by the Russian Federation. Mr. President, it is high time for the Council to fulfill its mandate enshrined in the UN Charter and ensure peace and security will come to the Ukrainian people. In this era of erosion of respect for the UN Charter, international law, international humanitarian law, Security Council resolutions, and sanctions, we need to reflect on how to rebuild trust to secure the relevance of this body, and most of all, to secure our future. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, first of all, I would like to, on behalf of the Chinese delegation, to extend our deep condolences on the tragic passing of President Raisi and Foreign Minister Abdollahian in the helicopter accident, and extend our sincere sympathy to their families and to the government and people of Iran. President Raisi and Foreign Minister Abdollahian made important contributions to the promotion of the development of Sino-Iranian relationship and regional friendly cooperation. President, I thank High Representative Nakamitsu for her briefing. I've listened carefully to the statement by Ms. Kimberley. The crisis in Ukraine drags on. The continuing flow of large quantities of weapons and ammunition into the battlefield, their expanding variety and scope, their increasing lethality, and the cumulative risks of their diversion and proliferation are deeply concerning. The Council has considered the issue of weapons supplies to Ukraine on many occasions, and the positions of the parties have been made very much clear to each other. I would like to reiterate that weapons may end wars, but they do not bring about lasting peace. Conflicts may have different starting points, but they all end in diplomatic negotiations. China calls on all parties concerned to put peace and humanity first, concentrate their resources and energy on diplomatic efforts for a cessation of hostilities and a ceasefire, and work together to promote an early political settlement to the crisis in Ukraine. Since the outbreak of the Ukraine crisis, China has always maintained an objective and impartial stance, communicated with all parties, and persisted in promoting peace talks. 2 weeks ago, during his visit to 3 European countries, President Xi Jinping fully elaborated on China's position on Ukraine to the European leaders. He emphasized that China understands the impact of the Ukraine crisis on the people of Europe, and hopes that a ceasefire will be achieved as soon as possible so that peace and stability can return to the European continent at an early date. Last week, President Xi Jinping and the visiting Russian leader also had an in-depth exchange of views on the Ukraine crisis, stressing that a political solution to the crisis is the right direction. It is necessary to address both the symptoms and the root causes of the problem and promote the building of a new type of security architecture that is balanced, effective, and sustainable. I would like once again to urge the parties to the conflict to show political will, move toward each other, and start peace talks at an early date so that a ceasefire can be realized. We urge the international community to create conditions and provide assistance to that end. China stands ready to continue to make unremitting efforts and play a constructive role in the promotion of an early political settlement to the Ukraine issue. President, my American colleague just made groundless accusations against China in his statement. Some of the comments are totally unacceptable. I would like to respond to the comments in the following 3 points. First, China is not the creator or a party to the Ukraine crisis. Nor have we provided lethal weapons to any party to the conflict. We have not and will not. Like what the U.S. has been doing, which is deliberately prolonging the fighting. We will not do that, and we will not profit from the crisis. Our position is above board and crystal clear. That is to promote peace talks and a political settlement. Second, China has the right to carry out normal economic and trade cooperation with all countries in the world, including Russia, and such cooperation should not be interfered with or undermined. China always has very strict control over the export of dual-use items. We urge the U.S. to stop attacking, smearing, slandering China, and spreading fabrications, and stop unilateral sanctions against and the unreasonable suppression of Chinese enterprises. Third, the international community is crystal clear about the intentions of the U.S. regarding the Ukraine crisis. We advise the U.S. that diverting attention and shifting the blame is not the right way to resolve the Ukraine crisis. We also advise the U.S. to stop taking advantage of the Ukraine crisis to advance its geopolitical strategy, provoke a bloc confrontation, and to serve its own agenda. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. I thank Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, for her informative briefing. I also carefully listened to Ms. Kimberley, and I should like to welcome the permanent representative of Ukraine this morning with us. Ecuador's historic position has always been and still is a rejection of armed violence, militarization and stockpiling of weapons, which is a stance which is compatible with the unwavering recognition of a right to legitimate defense, pursuant to international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Since Ecuador has already spoken on innumerable occasions when the Council has discussed this issue, I will focus today on three main points. Firstly, the international legal frameworks governing the transfer of weapons and ammunition must be respected. They are not one-off reference points. It is imperative to adopt measures to halt the threats represented by the massive flow of weapons and ammunition in any armed conflict, including the risks of diversion, proliferation and escalation. Secondly, Ecuador joins the call of the Secretary-General and the international community upon all parties to abstain from using explosive weapons in populated areas and to keep combat away from urban zones. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure constitute flagrant violations of international humanitarian law and are unacceptable. Thirdly, the use of weapons with indiscriminate and disproportionate effects must cease immediately. The Convention on the Prohibition of Anti-Personnel Mines, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and the provisions of the Convention on the Prohibition or Restriction on the Use of Certain Conventional Weapons inter alia must be fully upheld and implemented. President, just 6 days ago, this Council had a briefing on the serious humanitarian situation in Ukraine, where it noted that it is the civilians who pay the highest price during armed conflicts. The lives lost, the communities destroyed, and the human suffering cannot be ignored. They are immeasurable. Ecuador deplores the fact that the prolonged invasion of Ukrainian territory continues to exacerbate the risks of escalation, against a backdrop where global military expenditure in 2023 reached $2.44 trillion. Which is a 6.8% increase in real terms on 2022. Finally, I reiterate Ecuador's call that the Russian Federation withdraw its military troops from Ukrainian territory. And I urge the international community to step up collective agreements and efforts to facilitate peace talks with the aim of halting the violence in Ukraine and promoting peaceful coexistence between the parties. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sierra Leone learns with immense sadness the passing of the President, the Foreign Minister, and other officials of the Islamic Republic of Iran. On behalf of my delegation, we express our deepest condolences to the people of the Islamic Republic of Iran at this very tragic loss, and may the souls of the departed rest in peace. Mr. President, thank you for convening this briefing. I also thank Ms. Izomi Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, for a helpful briefing. We also know the contribution of Ms. Margaret Kimberley. I wish to welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Ukraine in this meeting. Sierra Leone takes note of the differing perspectives presented on the supply of arms with respect to the conflict in Ukraine since the onset of the conflict 2 years ago, including those relating to the right to self-defense and breaches of neutrality. The continuous supply of weapons has the potential to prolong and escalate the level of violence in the conflict, and we therefore underscore the importance of all parties in the conflict adhering to international legal frameworks in all weapons transfers, and most importantly, adhering to their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. We reiterate that all transfers of weapons in conflict situations should occur within the applicable international legal framework and relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions, and include pre-transfer risk assessments and end-user verification to prevent diversion of arms and ammunition. Mr. President, as we deliberate on arms supply relating to the conflict in Ukraine, it is important that we also highlight the devastating effects of weapons of war on civilians and civilian infrastructure. The proliferation of both small arms as well as high-level weaponry in conflict situations, including in Ukraine and in the Russian Federation, is a major challenge to efforts to resolve conflicts, protect civilians, and restore peace and security across the world. A case in point is reported collapse of the building and death of at least 15 people in the 12 May missile attack on an apartment building in the Russian city of Belgorod. We can also bear witness to reports of civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure and mass displacement of civilians in Ukraine. Reports from the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, OCHA, and UNICEF indicate that to date there have been at least 32,100 civilian casualties and 10,946 deaths, of which 2,000 are children in Ukraine. OCHA also reports that 14.6 million people, roughly 40% of Ukraine's population, needs some form of humanitarian assistance, while approximately 9.7 million people have been forcibly displaced by the war. The alarming civilian casualty figures and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine underscores the urgent need for all parties to the conflict to prioritize the protection of civilians and refrain from attacks on critical civilian infrastructure in line with international humanitarian law. Sierra Leone reiterates its commitment to upholding the principles of international law and the United Nations Charter, emphasizing the importance of respecting national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and encouraging peaceful settlement of disputes. In conclusion, Mr. President, Sierra Leone calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities, respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and good faith diplomatic efforts to achieve a peaceful and lasting resolution to the conflict, taking into account the legitimate concerns of all involved parties. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the important statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Mozambique. I wish to begin by conveying Mozambique's deepest condolences to the people and government of the Islamic Republic of Iran for the tragic loss inflicted upon them due to the untimely death of President Ibrahim Raisi, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Hossein Amir Abdollahian, and other senior officials and passengers. Distinguished Council members, I thank Mrs. Izumi Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, and Mr. Margaret Kimberley, activist and civil society representative, for their insightful briefings. I acknowledge the presence of the permanent representative of Ukraine in this meeting. Colleagues, we have been holding meetings to consider this topic on a regular basis since the outbreak of the conflict in Russia-Ukraine. Since the last meeting on April 12, the situation in Ukraine has not improved. On the contrary, it has worsened, and civilians continue to bear the brunt of death, danger, and destruction. The trend of incremental arms supplies to Ukraine reflects the escalatory nature of the conflict, a conflict that is marked by unbridgeable levels of mutual mistrust and the primacy of a military solution of a negotiated settlement. The risks of proliferation and the unintended consequences from escalating arms supplies are obvious. Such escalation can worsen insecurity, displacement, and divert resources from peace and understanding. Dear colleagues, Mozambique fully recognizes the legitimate right of each and every country to self-defense. It is a right that is enshrined in our Charter. In situations of conflict, we consider that equal measures of effort must be deployed so that peace and security are not endangered at local, regional, and international levels. Striking a balance between legitimate defense and preventing exacerbated violence is crucial. In this regard, we underscore the importance of arms control and responsible arms transfer within the spirit of the Charter, Article 11, and existing international legal framework. We call on all states that have not yet done so to adhere to all relevant international instruments on disarmament. It is against this backdrop that Mozambique has consistently advocated for a political and negotiated solution as the most viable way to end this conflict and lay the foundation for a lasting and sustainable peace between the two sister and neighboring countries. For that purpose, we reiterate our call on the parties to immediately cease hostilities, resume direct negotiations without preconditions, and actively engage in a constructive and meaningful dialogue. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Security Council. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement, and I give you the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be very brief. In response to the remarks made by my Chinese colleague, the U.S. will continue to call out those states that provide support to Russia's industrial base as it carries out its brutal aggression against the people of Ukraine. Our calls will not cease until that support to Russia ceases. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States. The representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement, and I grant it.
I will be very brief too. The position of China on the Ukraine crisis is impartial, and we stick to peaceful resolution of the crisis. We hope the countries concerned will not undermine the collective action of the efforts of the international community to seek a political solution to the issue, and then do more to help in these efforts.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I will now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, I express my appreciation of the briefing by High Representative Nakamitsu. I also recognize Putin's envoy in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. There is nothing remarkable about Ms. Kimberly's participation in today's meeting, other than her wonderful choice of Ukrainian flag colors, yellow and blue. And that is about it. We have already highlighted the detrimental impact of such Russian propaganda shows on the credibility and integrity of the Security Council. It is a mockery of the Council's mandate when the aggressor demands that the Council address complaints about the victim of aggression still having weapons to defend itself. It is a mockery of common sense when the aggressor makes such demands after opening a new front and thus significantly expanding the area of hostilities, human suffering, and destruction. The north of Kharkiv region, particularly the town of Vovchansk, is now suffering the same fate as other hotspots of the Russian war against my country. Settlements are being razed to the ground, people are fleeing their homes, those who cannot evacuate are subjected to inhumane treatment by Russian soldiers. Unfortunately, there have already been reports of executions of local residents by Russian soldiers in the northern part of the town of Vovchansk. In particular, the Kharkiv prosecutor's office is investigating the murder of a disabled person in a wheelchair near the local hospital committed by Russian forces. This was discovered through footage filmed by a Ukrainian reconnaissance drone on May the 17th. Yesterday, Russian airstrikes killed 12 civilians, including a pregnant woman, in the village of Cherkasska-Lazava, Novoasinove, and Kovsharivka in the Kharkiv region, as Russian terrorists once again resorted to the tactics of double strike. 2 paramedics were among the victims. Russian-guided aerial bombs, ballistic and cruise missiles, shells and mines continue to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure, kill Ukrainian people, and poison the natural environment of Ukraine. We are alarmed that Russian troops flagrantly violate the Chemical Weapons Convention by resorting to artillery shelling with chemically hazardous substances. In April alone, 444 cases of use by Russia of ammunition containing hazardous chemicals were recorded. That is 71 cases more than in March. We remain concerned about Russia's ongoing attempts to exploit the occupation of the Zaporizhzhia NPP as a part of its military strategy. Russia continues to use its territory to launch drones and train drone pilots, taking advantage of the fact that the defense forces of Ukraine cannot return fire in the 1.5-kilometer zone around the plant. Russia's obsessive inclination to request council meetings on weapon supplies is in fact a manifestation of their desire to expand such a no-return fire zone to the entire Ukraine. For Ukraine, however, this is a matter of survival. We are therefore grateful to our allies who continue to support our fight. Air defense systems will help protect Ukrainian infrastructure. Fighter jets will help push back the Russian aircraft that currently launch guided aerial bombs from deep within their territory. Armor and artillery will help move the front line away and restore normal life in the territories occupied by Russia. Ukraine will continue to exercise its inherent right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter until threats to its people and its sovereignty are removed and the Russian aggression is stopped. Mr. President, since the beginning of the Russian aggression, illegitimacy narratives have been the backbone of Russian propaganda. To justify its aggression in 2014, Russia made claims about a so-called coup d'etat in Ukraine. To justify Russia's invasion in February 2022, Putin openly called for the Ukrainian army to topple the Ukrainian government, labeling it illegitimate. To justify its unwillingness to end the war, Russia keeps repeating its illegitimacy narrative like a broken record, this time by misinterpreting or completely ignoring the provisions of the Ukrainian constitution and Ukrainian laws regarding the term of authority of the President of Ukraine. Let me clear the Russian mess and set the record straight so that there is at least some use of this massive misuse of the Council by the Russian delegation. In accordance with the Article 103 of the Constitution of Ukraine, the President of Ukraine is elected by the citizens of Ukraine for a 5-year term on the basis of universal, equal, and direct suffrage by secret ballot, something possibly not really known in Russia until now. Paragraph 1 of Article 108 stipulates that the President of Ukraine exercises his or her powers until the assumption of office by the newly elected President of Ukraine. This constitutional provision enshrines the fundamental principle of institutional continuity of presidential power. Paragraph 6 of Article 103 stipulates that the procedure for conducting elections of the President of Ukraine is established by law. And the law, in its turn, is very clear. In accordance with Article 19 of the Law of Ukraine on the legal regime of martial law, during martial law, it is prohibited to hold elections of the President of Ukraine, as well as parliamentary and local elections. In accordance with Article 20 of the Election Code of Ukraine, and I quote, "In the event of martial law or state of emergency being imposed in Ukraine or its separate territories, The election process of national elections and/or local elections held in these territories or their parts shall be terminated from the date of entry into force of the respective decree of the President of Ukraine." End of quote. Article 11 of the Law of Ukraine on the legal regime of martial law stipulates that in the event of the term of power of the President of Ukraine expiring during a state of martial law, the President's powers are extended until the new President of Ukraine, elected after the abolition of martial law, assumes office. Martial law in Ukraine was announced by the decree of the President of Ukraine on the imposition of martial law in Ukraine of 24 February 2022, the day that Russia started its invasion. According to the Constitution of Ukraine, this decree has been endorsed by the Ukrainian Parliament. It remains effective today because Russia continues its war of attrition. The broad area of active combat, as well as Russia's regular missile and drone strikes across the entire territory of Ukraine, make it impossible to ensure adherence to international standards and commitments on the right of democratic elections, including proper election administration, a safe environment for campaigning, international monitoring, and voting. After the termination of abolition of martial law or a state of emergency, the electoral process, which has been suspended in this connection, shall begin again. The Election Code of Ukraine envisages that the decision on calling elections, the electoral process of which was suspended or did not begin due to the imposition of martial law or state of emergency, shall be adopted by the subject of their appointment not later than 1 month from the date of termination or abolition of martial law or state of emergency, and if the law does not require a separate decision on the appointment for holding the elections, the Central Election Commission shall announce the start of the election process no later than 1 month from the date of termination or abolition of martial law or state of emergency. In November 2023, representatives of groups and factions of the Ukrainian parliament, both ruling coalition and opposition, met within the framework of Jean Monnet dialogues for peace and democracy and signed conclusions on reaching an agreement that elections will be held after the end of the war and abolition of martial law. They also agreed to elaborate a special law regulating the specifics of the first post-war elections. This is plain and simple. If Putin's envoy is genuinely concerned about Ukrainian elections, he should, instead of requesting Security Council meetings, recommend his master in the Kremlin stop the aggression and withdraw the troops from the territory of Ukraine. As you know, on May the 7th, Russia held a ceremony to install Vladimir Putin in office. In this way, the Russian authorities are attempting to give the entire world and its own citizens the illusion of legality for the nearly lifelong stay in power of the person who has turned the Russian Federation into an aggressor state and the ruling regime into a dictatorship. During the so-called March elections, the Russian Federation violated numerous international documents that serve as a foundation for the modern system of international relations. In particular, the UN Charter, the Declaration of the Principles of International Law, the Geneva Convention on the Protection of Civilian Persons in Time of War, the final act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and dozens of UN General Assembly resolutions. The illegal organization of another so-called electoral process in the sovereign territories of Ukraine, temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation, parts of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions, the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and the city of Sevastopol, accompanied by threats, blackmail, and coercion of millions of Ukrainian citizens who live in the temporarily occupied territories or were forcibly relocated to the territory of the Russian Federation constituted a brutal violation of the generally recognized norms and principles of international law. Despite warnings from authoritative international institutions, the Russian Federation's actions once again demonstrated that its leadership did not recognize its responsibility and is unwilling to end the illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified full-scale armed aggression against Ukraine, which has lasted more than 2 years and resulted in numerous human casualties and destruction. The Kremlin regime, through propaganda and manipulation, uses voter participation and voting results to justify its military invasion of Ukraine and aggressive policies towards other countries. Based on the foregoing and the International Criminal Court's active arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, it is a fact that there is no legal basis for recognizing him as a democratically elected and legitimate president of the Russian Federation. Recent resolution of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, dated April 17, and the European Parliament, dated April 25, confirm the ineligibility of holding so-called elections in Ukraine's temporarily occupied territories, their undemocratic nature in Russia itself, and in fact refute the legitimacy of their results. We call on foreign countries, international organizations, and the public to follow suit by not recognizing the results of these pseudo-elections or Russian dictator Vladimir Putin as a legitimate president. To resist the demolition of the system of the rule of law and universally recognized democratic values, as well as to continue effectively supporting Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression, which poses a threat to European and world security, peace and stability. Until such steps are taken, strong international solidarity remains the most effective response to both Russian aggression and propaganda. Solidarity with Ukraine saves the lives of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians. It also undermines the aggressor's potential to spread violence to other countries. Finally, solidarity with Ukraine will bolster out our efforts to achieve a comprehensive, just and lasting peace on the basis of the UN Charter. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their important statement. Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement, and I grant him.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am not going to lengthen our discussion, but I just want to illustrate the reliability of the information that the representative of the Kiev regime has said. Only 17%, according to the recent survey, of the Ukrainian population believes in the legitimacy of their presidency. In particular, the Ukrainian government has not taken this issue to the Constitutional Court because it is worried it's not going to get the response that it wants. Irrespective of the legitimacy or the illegitimacy of Mr. Zelensky has no impact whatsoever anyway on our special military operation. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.